We are moving into Acts chapter 7. As John mentioned, it's the longest chapter in the book. But at the same time, it's probably one of the easiest chapters in the book for us to go through. Simply because there's not a whole lot of theology in here, not a whole lot of controversy in it, and not a whole lot of factual situations to figure out. What's chapter 7 about? Stephen. So Stephen's going to defend himself against the charges brought against him that we looked at last week. And that's what we're going to pick up. So let's say a little prayer and we'll get started. God, we thank you for all that you do for us. We thank you for tonight, for this class. Pray that your Spirit will be with us as we discuss the account of Stephen's defense. And Father, we pray that should we ever find ourselves in a similar situation, that we would have the boldness and faith to stand up for what is right as well. God, we just praise you for keeping these records for us so that we can see the early church unfold and grow and learn the message you would have us to have. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, this book is long enough. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but my brother would be not to spend the class time reading it. They say it's the longest chapter in the book of Acts, 60-something verses. Is it okay if we don't read it? We'll read it as we go along, as we try to answer our questions to you. Is that okay? Okay. Yeah. What's Stephen been charged with?
Speaking against the Holy Temple.
Okay. Speaking against the temple and against the law of Moses. Remember, we looked the last couple of weeks, the two things the Jews held priceless was the law of Moses and the temple. Couldn't speak against either one of those, or you're blaspheming God. The temple is their place of worship. We talked about that a little bit Sunday in the sermon, that this was the place all the Jews revered. They looked at that and they thought, this is where God comes to. This is where God encounters us. This is where we have to go to sacrifice. Got to do all this stuff. It was a special building for the Jews. Along comes Stephen basically saying, man, it's just a bunch of junk. But same with the law of Moses. That was the law that controlled them. And so he's speaking, seems to be speaking against the law of Moses. So the thing I asked you to do last week when we left was, and maybe even the week before, read Acts chapter 2 and 3 again. That's where Peter defends himself against his first arrest, actually the first sermon in chapter 2, then the arrest in chapter 3. And then look at Stephen's defense and see what you can find where the defenses or the stories or the sermons are similar. So did any of you do that? Look and see what's similar about what Stephen says versus what Peter had said back in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 3. My phone falls.
That they crucified Jesus.
All right, that's there. Certainly is. Peter makes that clear in both Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 3. When we get to that part here that Stephen's defense goes into, he doesn't pull any punches. You know, can you remember what Peter said when he accused them of killing Jesus from Acts 2 or 3? This class may take longer than I thought.
What was the question?
What did Peter say when he accused, first of all, the Jews in Acts chapter 2, and then the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 3? What did he accuse them of when he accused them of killing Jesus? Look at verse 23 of chapter 2. Remember, this is Peter telling this first group on the day of Pentecost. He's standing there with all these Jews. He's giving the first, what we call the first gospel sermon. He's gone through some history. He says, beginning in verse 23, this man, speaking of Jesus, was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. What's the wiggle room Peter gives these people?
The help of the lawless Gentiles?
Wicked people, yeah. You know, the wiggle room meaning, here's Peter accusing them of killing Jesus.
But it was God's deliverance.
There you go. There's the wiggle room. God had a plan. You killed him, but God had a plan, and you got together with these other wicked men, and he ends up dying. That's Acts chapter 2. He's talking to Jews. He's telling them, yeah, you did it, but you know, it really wasn't your fault. God had a plan. These other wicked men were involved, and that's why he dies. So now look at chapter 3, where he gets arrested and has to defend himself. Look at verse 17. Now, brothers, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did your leaders. But this is how God fulfilled what he had foretold through all the prophets. Same wiggle room. Hey, you guys killed him. It's all your fault. But it was God's plan. And you were ignorant. You just didn't know what you were doing. And so, even though you did it, I'm not going to place all the blame on you because you just didn't know what you were doing. Now look at Acts chapter 7, towards the end of the chapter, verse 51.
Yeah, I always think he didn't leave a lot of wiggle room.
He didn't leave any wiggle room. You stiff-necked people with uncircumcised hearts and ears. You are just like your fathers. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your fathers did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. He doesn't pull a single punch. It is no longer, you didn't really know what you're doing. God had a plan and you're just sort of going along with God's plan. It's, you guys are a bunch of losers and you killed the Messiah. I mean, he doesn't give them any wiggle room at all. I think that's important to see in the scenario of those first two speeches and this one. Because the first two, what happens to the apostles?
They get let go.
Essentially nothing. Yeah. First one, he gives a sermon, everybody hears it and accepts Jesus, 3,000 people get baptized. Second one, they tell him, don't do this anymore, and off they go. Stephen doesn't get so lucky. Stephen gets himself killed. But he comes out, and he's not pulling any punches. He's not giving them any excuse. It isn't, this is God's plan, and you just did what you had to. It was you guys, and notice he uses uncircumcised of heart. In other words, you're a Gentile. You're not even the people of God anymore. You haven't fulfilled the covenant of circumcision. Your heart is so hardened, so unclean. You people are nothing.
Well, and they stopped listening to him because in 57
Yes.
it says, then they put their hands over their ears and began shouting.
That's exactly right.
They didn't even want to hear what he had to say beyond that.
They weren't going to hear what he had to say. You know, it's, you know, I don't want to hear you, I'm not listening. That's exactly what happens. But it's partly because Stephen didn't let him off the hook. There was no room anymore for these leaders of the Jews to have an excuse. You guys have killed the Messiah. Period. That's just the end of it. And so they kill him. What else is similar between what Peter does and what Stephen has done?
A little bit of history.
A lot of history, yeah. A little bit in the first two, tons of history.
Yeah, Stephen really lays it on him.
He does.
It's a
We're gonna look at
snapshot.
some of that in a little more detail, which you're absolutely right. He gives them, Peter gives them quotes from Joel. The second one, he gives them, David did this, and David said that, and does these other people. Stephen gives them, you want to know what the history of the Jews is? Read Acts chapter 7. I mean, he goes from the beginning to pretty much the end of the United of the Kingdom with a whole lot of detail. A lot of historical background here. Why was Peter giving historical background?
To get their attention.
Yes,
So they would know that he knew what he was talking about.
absolutely. And to show them that what the prophecies were have been fulfilled right here. You've seen this happen. What's Stephen using Old Testament stuff for?
Well, the same thing, just he ends a little different.
Yeah, I think he ends different, Scott, because he's using it to show these people, and we'll look at this a little more detail. You screwed up from the beginning. You people who think you're God's chosen people, you people who are worshiping Moses and the temple, you've never got it right. Notice Peter, his first sermon is, this is just what's fulfilled by Joel, and here it is, and this is unfolding today. Stephen comes along and says, you didn't obey it then, you didn't obey it then, you didn't obey it then, and you're not obeying it now. You people have never got it right. I mean, he's just in their face. Why do you think Stephen's acting that way instead of placating the people like Peter did? Why has he suddenly become so harsh?
That's a good question, because it gets him killed. He had to know that he was going to upset them.
Things are not going to end well.
I mean, he
But why do you think he
just
does
leveled them at the end of his sermon.
Why the switch? Think back to last week. Who is Stephen?
He's a man full of God's grace and power.
He's that. What else is he? Yes, he's Greek. Remember, we saw the two groups last week. You got the Hebraic Jews, who pretty much live in Jerusalem, raised in Jerusalem, probably speak Aramaic. Then you've got the Hellenistic Jews who have come from somewhere else, moved to the community. They're not local. They haven't been under the Sanhedrin and the temple people their whole lives like the Hebraic Jews have been. Stephen and Philip, who we'll see next time, along with the other five that appointed to take care of the feeding problem, they're Hellenistic Jews. They're not living in this community. They're probably not even speaking the same language. And they don't have the, I was going to say attraction, that's the wrong word, loyalty, I guess, to Jerusalem and to the temple and to the Sanhedrin. These people aren't bound by the historical gathering that all these Hebrew Jews who live in Jerusalem would have been. He doesn't respect these people. They're nobody to him. They may be the Jewish Sanhedrin, but he isn't raised there. He doesn't care. You know, we see just what you and I talked about earlier, Scott. You know, people who are not raised where you're raised, who don't respect the same thing, and we look at life today where they don't even respect hard work. Okay, but they weren't raised with that. So they have no reason to respect hard work like most of us do. And so you find Stephen, who's talking to these people who are not people of authority to him, not people he really needs to respect, because he wasn't raised there. He's Greek. He's Jewish, but he's a Hellenistic Jew. And so he doesn't kiss their you-know-what, like Peter does. Peter's always, hey, you guys, you were ignorant, didn't mean it. And it's the same group of people. They tried him, tried Peter. Now they're trying Stephen, same group of people. But Peter says, oh, you guys are ignorant. You didn't know what you're doing. There's a bunch of wicked people involved in this besides you. It's not your fault. Stephen didn't say that at all. He says, you're just like all those people who have ever thought they were doing God's will. They messed it up, and messed it up. And now not only have you messed it up, your hearts are been uncircumcised. You are as unfaithful a Jew as I could possibly be. And yet they go crazy. We're not listening to this anymore. And kill him. What else? A couple more that I can think of. Who's Jesus? According to all three of you, these two speeches. Son of God. How is he described by Peter and then by Stephen?
The Son of Man.
That's what Stephen calls him. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. What does Peter call him? What does Peter call Jesus?
Well, they both called him the just one.
He calls him, he's the Lord in Christ. Peter's description in both of his talks is he's the Messiah. He's the one the Old Testament has looked forward to. He's the one we're looking for. This, and you killed him out of ignorance with the help of bad people, but still, he's Lord in Christ. So he's still playing to the Jews' sense of, we're looking for this Messiah. Okay, he shows up. Stephen calls him what, Debbie?
The Messiah.
No, not Stephen.
I mean, the
Son of Man.
Messiah.
Son of Man.
Yeah.
Calls him the Son of Man. Who's the Son of Man? Jesus is. That's not a hard question. Jesus is the Son of Man. But notice Stephen doesn't call him the Messiah. Doesn't call him the one, who's going to come redeem Israel. He's the Son of Man. This is the only place in the New Testament outside the Gospels where Jesus is called the Son of Man. Why would that raise an alarm with the Sanhedrin? Certainly that's part of it, and of course that's why they killed him, because he has power. Speaking of Jesus, remember Jesus called himself the Son of Man. That was a reference Jesus used to himself several times. And when Jesus is standing in front of the Sanhedrin before they execute him, and they ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" He says, "Yes, and you'll see the Son of Man standing with the Father." He calls himself that, and then Stephen ends up at the very end, before they stone him to death, "I see the Son of Man standing by the throne of the Father." And you can imagine the Sanhedrin, who probably 2 or 3 years earlier than this was not very far past the crucifixion. Same group of people. Jesus stands in front of them and says, "You're going to see the Son of Man standing by the throne of God." Stephen, "I can see my vision. I see the Son of Man standing by the throne of God." You know good and well that Sanhedrin said to themselves, "He's accusing us of killing God. Because there's God, there's Jesus, the Son of Man, standing by the throne." Same terminology, exactly. That's when they stoned him to death. They shut their ears off and blah, and then Stephen said, "I see the Son of Man standing by God's throne." They've just killed the Son of Man, the guy who called himself that, just a few years earlier. And they're thinking, remember when we got those few chapters, they're thinking, well, this is over. We've killed this guy. Let's get back to normalcy. They're not very normal. The crowd is following this Jesus guy. And suddenly here's this Hellenistic Jew who dares come into our court and accuse us of being uncircumcised in heart. And then he's got the audacity to say, "I see the Son of Man." The same guy that claimed to be the Son of Man that you guys killed. He's there by the throne of God in heaven. I can just see these people, steam coming out of their ears. I mean, they're just going berserk because they've now been accused of killing the guy they did in fact kill. And that guy is standing beside the throne of God. If you put all that together, you can see why suddenly these people are just living. We've already killed that guy once. Now we'll shut you up as well. So they do. A couple of other things I noted, and this is, he gives them a stroke to begin with. Remember Peter in both of his talks, fellow Jews and all of Jerusalem, fellow Israelites. Stephen at least tries. Brothers and fathers. He identifies with them. I'm part of you guys. I'm Jewish. I'm right there with you. We've already talked about it. He appeals to the Old Testament, much more so than Peter does on either of his sermons. And we'll look at that and see why that might have been here in just a minute. But he appeals to the Old Testament, gives them a lot of history. He makes it pretty clear Jesus is the Messiah. In the first two, and this one, Stephen calls him the righteous one. He's the one who's right with God. And then later call him the Son of Man, and he's standing by the throne. They killed him. We've already talked about that. Peter gives him a break doesn't really come out and say it's all your fault. You didn't know what you were doing. It was God's plan. Stephen doesn't cut him any slack at all. You guys murdered the Messiah. I mean, that's just all the way there is to it. There's no excuse for you. You're the bad guys. And last, Jesus is in heaven. But Peter and his talks, both of them, say God exalted him, raised him up, lifted him up, took him into heaven. Here Stephen says, I see him standing right there by the throne of God. This guy you killed, this righteous one that you guys thought you were rid of, he's standing by the throne of God. And just almost exactly the same kind of stuff, except you can hear the accusation in Stephen's speech that Peter doesn't have. Peter's sort of wimpy when we come to these two. He's looking for a way to just sort of get along. Yeah, you killed him.
Diplomatic.
He's very diplomatic. Good word. Peter was very diplomatic. Stephen's not. And again, I think part of that is Peter's a great Jew. I mean, he knows the temple. He knows these people. He's been in and out of Jerusalem for the last 3.5 years. Stephen's a Hellenistic Jew. He doesn't have a whole lot of loyalty to these people. And now you've arrested me on trumped up charges? Let me tell you who's trumped up here. Let me give you some pointers and let you know what's really going on. So Stephen comes along and he emphasizes the Old Testament. And we'll look at some of this, but he gives basically 5 different ideas of what's important. One, he talks about Abraham. Abraham was in a faraway land. God called him out of that land. He traveled up here, and then after his daddy dies, calls him to the promised land. Off he goes. Then he gives us a big, long spiel about the history in Egypt, about Jacob and Isaac, and then Joseph, how his brothers killed him or wanted to kill him, threw him in the pit, sold him down there. He ends up in Egypt. Then he tells us, he gives a whole big section about the life of Moses. Moses, raised in Pharaoh's court, kills some guy, flees, comes back later because he sees the burning bush, shows up to deliver the people from Pharaoh who doesn't listen. And then he gives us an account of the wilderness wandering. We're out there. He even talks about the golden calf. You know, and notice when he talks about Joseph and the patriarchs, oh, by the way, his brothers are the ones who put him in jail. His brothers are the ones that sold him into slavery. You know, these wonderful patriarchs, these people we all are, our tribes are named for. You know, our whole nation is divided around these 12 dudes. They're the ones who threw him in captivity. Moses is the same way. The people in Egypt, when Moses, after he kills one of the Egyptian guys, comes back to help his people, and they say, oh, you're going to kill us like you did those guys? The very people he's there to save, the very people he's coming to redeem through God's will, are the ones who say, who do you think you are? You can't do this, right? You killed that Egyptian. Who made you boss? Then he gives us Moses in the wilderness, and again, they weren't out there a month, and suddenly they're building golden calves and rejecting Moses, and Moses is having to appeal to God. Don't kill all these people, you know, give them a break. And then we get the tabernacle, and the tabernacle travels all over the place and moves around, and ultimately he says, and by the way, Solomon builds the temple. Stops right there. There's no glorification of the temple. There's no sense of temple special. It's, oh yeah, and Solomon built it. And then he moves out of there. But he points out in every one of these little sections, it were the people who were being saved who were the most rebellious. Who was the one God sent Moses to and Joseph was trying to help? Those are the people who end up being the most obstinate people who cause all the trouble. And I can just hear Stephen wanting to say, isn't that you? And he does, in fact, say that, doesn't he? Which one of the prophets did your ancestors not kill? And now you've done the same thing. You killed the righteous one. And so he's laid the foundation of here's God, here's Joseph trying to help everybody. Brothers hate him. God uses him. Here's Moses. People don't want him. People rebel against him. They're worshiping idols. God takes him. God used him to redeem his people. Here comes Jesus. Nobody likes him. Nobody wants him. The leading Jews say, we don't like what you're saying. They end up killing him. All Jesus wanted to do was redeem his people. You see the pattern going through, and that's why Stephen then says, you guys, hard-hearted, uncircumcised of heart, which prophets did you not kill? And now you've killed this guy. And so he lays down the Old Testament story of you people who are just like the people who have lived all through the Old Testament. All you do is rebel against God. You won't listen. You're just obstinate. You just won't pay attention to what's going on. And so much more in your face kind of use of the Old Testament than Peter was. So what's the accusation again against Stephen? What are they accusing him of?
Blasphemy.
Yeah. Well, and what do they say there in Acts chapter 6? They come before them and say what?
Blasphemy against Moses and against God.
Yeah, he's...
In a roundabout way, he was doing that, sort of. I mean, maybe not the way they're saying it, but he was telling them, or trying to tell them, there was a new covenant, that the law of Moses was no longer to be applied. So in a roundabout way, he is kind of doing what they're saying that he's doing. They're just making him sound blasphemous.
And we covered a little of that last week. In a sense, he is.
Sure.
Because Jesus said the temple's going to be destroyed.
Right.
Yeah, he was referring to the temple, but he's talking about himself. But he says all these stones will be destroyed. And that's what they accuse him of there in verse 14 of chapter 6. We've heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us. Jesus didn't destroy the temple. It got destroyed, though. And certainly the plan was, we're going to change the customs Moses has given us. We're not going to be doing this stuff anymore. But those people, he doesn't really accuse Moses of anything. And in his speech, he's very complimentary of Moses. But you guys aren't listening. You guys aren't paying attention, because notice what he says in Acts chapter 7, in verse 49. Let's start in 40. As he's talking about, in Solomon, who built the house for him. That's all he says about the temple. Then he says, however, even though I just mentioned the temple, which is good, the Most High, meaning God, does not live in houses made by hands. So, hey, you've got this temple and you think that's the only place God lives? Guess what? He doesn't live there. And the whole purpose of the church is to show that God's everywhere. And then just Jews. You know, to the Jews, the temple's in Jerusalem. That's the only place God is. You can't find him anywhere else. And here comes Stephen saying, God doesn't live in a building made with hands. This temple that you guys revere and that you think it's so awesome, God doesn't live there. He's not there at all. And so again, he's telling them, these leaders of the Jews, the Sanhedrin, who thinks they've got it made and they're all right with God, you don't have a clue what you're talking about. God's not in this temple. He's not living there. And of course, they don't want to hear that. So they're after him. So that's his accusation. He doesn't stop speaking against the holy place and against the law. We've heard him say that Jesus would destroy the place, change the custom Moses handed down to us. And as Scott said, that's not necessarily not true. But others are coming up with accusations and accusing him of things that was false, because Luke says that's what happened. So what's Stephen's point? We sort of touched on this a little bit. What's his primary accusation against the people in the Sanhedrin and the leading Jews?
They are rejecting God's gift.
Absolutely.
And have made it clear that they, throughout history, have rejected everything God tried to do for them.
Every messenger he sent, they said no to. Every person who God sent to redeem them, they said no to. And it took, for lack of a better word, an act of God for them to see that maybe we better pay attention to these people. You know, Joseph, the patriarchs, throw him in the pit, sell him to the Midianites. It took a famine and an act of God for Joseph to rise as far as he did in Egypt. For the patriarchs to realize maybe we better listen to Joseph. Maybe he can help us out here. But look what it took to get them there. Slavery, starvation, famine, begging these Egyptians to get us some food.
Hard times.
Hard time. But had that not happened, they wouldn't have listened. Here comes Moses. They don't want to listen to Moses. But it took the plagues. It took God bringing the Ten Commandments. It took God killing the people with the golden calf. It took all kinds of things for the people to finally realize maybe we better pay attention to Moses. But they resisted as long as they could.
And they still are.
And they still are, absolutely. They've been doing it from the get-go. And they do, here in Acts chapter 7, they kill God's messenger because they don't want to hear it. They're not listening.
But just like everything else God did throughout history, this turns out to be a turning point.
That's exactly
A
right.
good thing for God, bad
Yes.
thing for Stephen.
This turns out to be the fulfillment of prophecy. Because remember what Jesus said there in Acts chapter 1. You'll be my witnesses where?
Everywhere.
Yeah, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And this is almost like the Tower of Babel. The people have gathered in this one plain. God said, go populate the earth. They said, we're going to stay right here and build this tower so we can reach God. And it took the confusion of voices for the people to scatter across the earth. Similar situation here. The church has started. They're all in Jerusalem. Everybody's taking care of each other. Got this one big happy family. If we don't start some persecution, these people are never going to leave. So persecution starts, and we'll see in the next chapter. Christians spread all over the world like they're supposed to. But it doesn't happen yet. They don't do what they're supposed to do yet. They've got to move on. So we've talked about some of these already. Patriarchs were jealous of Joseph. Moses thought his own people would realize God was using him, but they did not. The ancestors refused to obey him. They wanted Aaron to make gods for them when he's up on the mountain. Again, he's just repeating this. And then if you stiff-necked, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You won't listen. And now you've done the same thing those other people did. You've rebelled against the messenger God sent. Just like we've watched all through history. And so he lays it out step by step by step in a very good history of the Jews, but very pointed, very much making them see we've always rebelled against God's messengers, and you're doing the exact same thing. Second point he tries to make, I think, is God works his will in places other than Jerusalem and the temple. You know, to the Jews, this was it. God isn't anywhere else but right here. The temple's the place he's at. It's where we worship. It's where you've got to show up and sacrifice your animals. And along comes Stephen, and again, he gives this very nice history of the Jews. We don't ever get to Jerusalem while he's given this history of the Jews. He covers everything else but that, showing them, I think, God didn't need your temple. He's not limited to this building here in Jerusalem. Notice he says he appears to Abraham in Mesopotamia. Far, far away. You know, the land of Babylon, way over there, those bad guys that defeated us. They sell Joseph into Egypt. And God's right there with Joseph. God was with him. How can God be with him if God's always in this temple up there? Moses is born again. He's in Egypt. God shows up. Moses is educated. God takes care of him. After 40 years, the angel appears in the burning bush. He's up the land near Mount Sinai. He's nowhere close to Jerusalem. Doesn't have anything to do with this temple you guys are so proud of. But God shows up, sitting there, working with Moses in the middle of the desert. Leads him out of Egypt. Once again, we're back in Egypt. Wanders in the wilderness for 40 years. He's there in the tabernacle. He's with them all that 40 years of wandering. God's right there with them. He's not in some temple somewhere. He's not limited to Jerusalem. God's everywhere. And so even though if you weren't paying attention to what Stephen is saying, you could be listening to this if you were that Sanhedrin group thinking, well, yeah, that's right. Yeah, preach it, brother, preach it. You got it, man. That's us. That's us Jews. We got it right, just like you're saying. That's us. We got all this history with us. God's always taking care of us without even realize what Stephen's doing.
I do think that's what they were.
I think so,
Nodding along, smiling. This guy knows what he's talking about.
the story, and they're not at all getting the idea that he's about to turn the tables and just zap them. They could hear this and say, oh yeah, God was in that tabernacle, that's where he came, his glory came in. Well, if he's doing that, he doesn't need your temple, does he? But they're not hearing that part. They're just hearing all this wonderful history thinking, oh yeah, God's been with us forever. But they're not catching on to what Stephen's doing. Then he throws that out there. God doesn't live in a house made by hands. You know, and again, he just throws, it's a temple, and oh, by the way, David wanted to do it, but he couldn't, so Solomon did in the story. This temple that you guys are so proud of, God doesn't live there. I think they're getting it now. That probably is what turned the corner. And then he again just lays it out to them and say, you guys, you've killed all the prophets. Which one didn't you persecute? And now you've killed this one.
He really lets them have it.
He does. I mean, and then the story is, of course, they, as you said, he covered their ears. No, let's see, let's see. And then he says, and by the way, I see the Son of Man, you know, that guy you killed a couple of years ago who said he was the Son of Man, he's going to show up in heaven. I see him there. That's the final straw. And so they drag him outside the city and stone him to death. Because they're not going to listen to this. And that's the end of Stephen. He falls asleep.
I think God took him. I don't think they actually got to kill him with the rocks. I think God took him.
And that's conceivable, that God prevented him from having to suffer any more than he did.
Well, yours said he falls asleep. Mine says with that he died. After he said, Lord, you know, don't charge him with this sin. I think God took him right then.
And that's conceivable. I think God showed him some grace and mercy.
Sure. Because I'm sure getting stoned to death is very painful.
I'm thinking one rock's bad enough.
And I'm sure it takes a while to die from people throwing rocks at you.
You would think so. And just, well, depending on how big they are, will they hit you?
Sure.
But they're mad, they're angry, they're after him. And so we've talked about this some already. How does Stephen's speech differ from the others that we looked at? We looked at how they're sort of the same.
Well, it's much longer and a lot less diplomatic.
Yeah.
It's straightforward.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, there's no God.
Yeah, he challenges the Jewish institutions. He's not being diplomatic at all. He's not being nice. He basically says, this law that you're so proud of, this temple that you think's awesome, you've messed it up from the get-go. You don't have a clue what you're talking about. And so he challenges that. Then notice too, whoops, my page go. He challenges not only as the ones who rejected the Messiah, but you're the ones who have rejected him all through history. Again, we've touched on this. Peter doesn't do that. Peter's really sweet. Peter's really nice. Peter wants to give them a break. Peter wants to make friends. Peter is not interested in making friends. He's just ready to tell
But there is a difference also, you know, when Peter's done Peter hurts a whole bunch of people, they say a bunch of people. That doesn't happen here.
No.
I mean, there's not a crowd of people that suddenly, you know, I mean, he comes at him pretty hard, and he does not get the same result Peter got.
And why not?
He
Why
hurt
not?
the feelings.
Well, Peter's purpose was to grow the church.
Okay, certainly it was, and Stephen's might not have been. But even notice when Peter and John get arrested, and then they get out of jail, and they're standing around preaching to people. Remember when the Sanhedrin sends the guards, they were afraid to do anything because the people liked Peter and John.
Right.
The crowd here, is the crowd that's stoning Stephen to death. There is no friendly group of people here. And maybe that was on purpose. They selected the people they wanted. They maybe sort of had a closed court, so there weren't any Christian sympathizers close by. But you notice that difference with Peter in both chapter 2 and 3. The people were on his side. Here, there's no one on Stephen's side. The whole crowd is out after his blood. And they drag him out, and they stone him to death. There's nobody to speak for him. And it's a strange turn of events, because we're just not that far down the road here. But no support at all. Someone wrote this, so I copied it because I thought it sounded cool. In short, those who think they are a people of God are not his people. Stephen's viewed as the first challenge Christianity's dependence on Jewish institutions. Before Stephen, the church assumed itself to be merely an extension of the Jewish nation, a remnant within it, to bring Israel back to a worship of God. Stephen shocks his listeners by saying Israel as a whole had never truly worshipped God to begin with. I think that's a good point. You know, Stephen isn't trying to pull everybody back to Judaism and let's get it right, which is sort of the message you can see from Peter. It's, hey, we're all Jews. God's now got us the Messiah. Let's worship the way we're supposed to. Let's hang in there together with this new Messiah. That isn't Stephen. Stephen comes along and says, you Jews have never got it right. God doesn't live in your temple. You guys are a bunch of losers. He's not at all trying to placate the Jewish society to say, we just need to get along here. He's being pretty clear, your days are numbered. You people are not going to be in charge anymore. God's got a new plan. And they don't want to hear it.
You know, and I almost feel sorry for them on that because, I mean, even though they're trying to hold on to their own power, they are trying to abide by the law of Moses.
In
And
your own
they're
opinion, what that
clinging
is, yes.
to it, and you think to yourself, well, here comes this group of people that tells them, that none of that matters anymore. We got to do this other stuff. I almost feel sorry for them.
I can in a sense because they're just not listening.
Sure,
Just
they're
don't
not.
get it.
They're stuck to the law of Moses, the tradition, and you know it does make you feel kind of bad for them that they won't listen to what's being told to them.
Yeah, and I think that's his next point. Before Stephen, the church thought of Jesus as a Jewish Messiah. And I really think the church did. I think Peter and John and those people in the first few chapters were still Jews. They're still going to the temple to worship. They're still making sacrifices. They're still doing all the Jewish stuff. But after Stephen, it becomes clear he's a savior of everybody, not just the Jews. Finally, we're starting to see God's moving outside Jerusalem. It's no longer a Jewish church. And we'll watch that in the next chapter as the Samaritans. Who? The Samaritans? We got Samaritans in our churches? You know, can you imagine the Jews thought, what is going on here? The people we hate worse than Gentiles are in the church. People are evangelizing them. And I think that's what's happening here with Stephen. The church has turned a corner. It's no longer a Jewish church. We're moving into the world. We're leaving this town. We're headed out. Stephen's speech implies that the Jewish institutions are of no value in themselves. You know, all the things you just place stock in, it's just not there anymore. God's presence and calling is not restricted to a certain land, some specific ethnic group, or the temple. He's everywhere. And the sooner you guys realize that, the better off we'll all be. They don't want to hear it. They're stuck in the mud. They're not about to give up their power. Remember, these are the ruling Sanhedrin. These are the people who govern the Jewish nation. They're not in charge of the territory, because that's Rome, and that's King Agrippa and Herod and all these other guys. But as far as Jewish society is concerned, the Sanhedrin rules. Well, if there is no Jewish society, they got no reason to rule. They have no purpose left anymore. So they're hearing that, getting pretty disturbed. By discussing Israel's sinful history, Stephen basically tells these Jews, you need a savior. You messed this up so bad. If you don't listen to Jesus, you're done for. You know, being a law of Moses guy doesn't work anymore. There's a Messiah, this righteous one that you killed, by the way. He's now standing by the throne of God, and you guys better turn to him, or you're in a world of hurt. They don't want to hear it. You know, and so they don't want to give up that power. So we've already touched on this. What does Stephen say to get himself stoned? I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. This Son of Man that was here a few years ago in front of you that you executed, he's now standing up there. You not only have you killed the Messiah, but he's up there. He's standing by God, and you put him there. So that's the accusation. Who's there standing by and watching Stephen get stoned?
Paul.
Yeah, Saul who becomes Paul. Paul's his Latin name, Saul's his Jewish name. He becomes Latinized because he leaves the area. He's traveling Gentile land, so to them, it's his Roman name is Paul. So he's standing there. We'll see a lot of Paul. Obviously, he covers most of the rest of the book once we get past the 2 chapters.
Well, he's not only standing there; he's giving approval.
Yes.
He's pushing it.
You know, he's the only one that we hear about after Stephen. He's the only one at that incident that we hear about.
Of that incident. We'll get Philip.
Right.
Yeah.
But I wonder how many of those people in that crowd eventually did come around. You know, the Bible doesn't really mention. I mean, I guess we're supposed to assume that they all just stay lost forever, but I would like to think that some of them, even though they might have participated, eventually came around. Because the church does continue to expand.
It does.
And what happens with Paul must have convinced some people somewhere.
Had to.
You would
Because
think.
here he is standing there, and we'll look next week. They're laying their coats at his feet.
Sure.
That isn't the sign of a slave. That's the guy in authority.
Absolutely.
We're laying our coats in front of you in honor to you, in deference to you. We're going to go stone this guy. We don't expect you to dirty your hands doing that. And we'll look at that next
So
week.
he goes from persecution to
Savior.
preaching.
Yeah.
And there had to be some people that saw that, but again, that's, I guess, more of God's plan. Hey, I'll use this guy. He's pretty rotten. I think I'll use him, you know.
Well, he had a huge following,
Absolutely.
so he had a huge influence to reach people that had already put trust into him.
You know, the same thing happens when we get next chapter, 2 chapters, chapter 9. Paul's on the road to Damascus, has a bright light, it's taken into the city. What happened to the other people who were there with him?
Yeah.
You know, the Bible says they heard that they saw the light, but they didn't see anything. And what happened to them?
You would have to assume that they were converted over. You'd have to.
But they're not in Ananias' house as far as we know. It's just Paul. Where did these guys go? Did they just leave as they took him into the city, led him into the city?
Spaceship picked them up.
Maybe
They saw the light.
I don't know. But I wonder, what happened to the rest of those guys? You know, they lead him into the city, and then what happened? Did they stay there and listen to Ananias and accept Jesus Christ? And we just don't hear about them? I don't have any idea.
You'd have to assume some of them.
I'd like to hope some of them did, because Paul's pretty influential.
They couldn't have been just strangers walking with Paul.
You know they weren't. They were his team. They were his honchos. They're the ones going with him to arrest all these people. So what happened to them? I don't know. We don't know. That ends chapter 7. Like I say, a real cool history lesson. If somebody ever wants to know what does the Old Testament talk about, go read Acts chapter 7. You got it. You know, for the most part, other than the Babylonian captivity, you got a pretty good idea of what the Jewish history was. He does a good job. Questions about that? Thoughts? Anybody? I will pick up next week with the other guy who was one of the 7. Only other one we hear about, Philip. And we'll see where he went and what he did. And he's also a Hellenistic Jew. So where he goes, you know, is interesting. He goes to Samaria. What a strange place for him to be going to.
Bumps into an Ethiopian.
He ends up there as well. All right. Let's close. God, thank you for tonight. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for letting us just review these stories in the book of Acts so we can watch you work. God, help us to have the boldness and spirit of Stephen, but also, God, help us to address people in a way that maybe they'll listen better than they did to Stephen. Help us to be compassionate when we need to be, and to be strong when we need to be. God, more than anything, help us to live for you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.